I want to start this video off with a more philosophical, kind of abstract angle than I might usually do, which is to ask a simple question that everybody probably thinks they know the answer to. And the question is, are there bad people? And the answer is, yes, of course there are bad people. Here's a bad person, that's a bad person, here's a terrible person. How could you ever suggest that there aren't bad people? Look at the terrible, awful things that they've done. Of course they're bad. So for anyone that hastily jumped to that obvious conclusion, I might have to slow you down for a moment as I pull out of my long lost bag of seldom used credentials this biology degree. It's metaphorical because I don't bring it to remote locations, but you're gonna have to trust that I have it. And it's useful at times to lecture the masses on human adaptability and malleability and how our environment forms the way that we interact with it to a degree, and the way that we perceive ourselves in the world to a degree that is not the case for other species, in that it's not likely that you're going to find a horse or a camel or a bird. Well, you might find a bird, but not the same species of bird in sub-Saharan Africa and the Sahara in Africa and the Arctic and you know, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean on a fisherman's boat. But we have Eskimos here as humans, we have people that live in the Saharas, we have pagans, we have Christians, we have atheists, we have people with cultural practices which are really strange, we have cannibals, we have a wide cohort of humans, and including within, even just between a relatively small, evolutionary speaking, number of generations within the same families or within the same groups of people. And that if you go far enough, I'm sure maybe my ancestors were in Mesopotamia pushing rocks around, and now I'm talking to you about them looking at a camera that they would have never imagined could existed in their entire lives. And that's just a function of how far humans have come, but also how adaptive we are to our environments. But there's a lot of different repercussions from having that much adaptability. Some of them are good, like the ones I mentioned, in that we can live in lots of different places and different cultures, and if there's a change in environment or climate, we might be more likely to be resilient from it than another species which is more niche to that specific circumstance. And so that's a good thing, in that it allows us to pass on more genes, and then also if cultures or societies are set up well, then people can flourish in different areas, so that's a good thing. But it also it's not just us that is able to adapt to our environment. In a way, in a large way, it's our environment that is adapting us to them. And so for example, I'm fortunate in that I don't have bug spray, but I have a fully developed prefrontal cortex, and that allows me to rationalize in a way that other creatures can't. And it took me a long time. It took me 25 years of long, hard development in order to get this prefrontal cortex, and same with everyone. And the reason for that, or the main reason, there's a few reasons. One reason is that humans are bipedal, and so that makes the birthing process pretty hard, which means that babies' heads, as they've expanded by a factor of like 2 over like a million years or so, have gotten too wide for the hips of the mothers, and there's a really high infant and mother mortality ratio, especially before midwives in modern medicine. And so then the development of, that's why babies have soft tops of their heads, so the development occurred outside the womb. But that's not the main reason. The main reason that it took 25 years for the prefrontal cortex in particular, which deals with kind of circumstantial sociological interactions, or interactions that are dependent on the environment that they're in, both sociological, as I mentioned, but also environmental, and what the best ways to interact with it are. The reason it took so long is because if it came out fully developed, that's pretty much what other creatures do, and that's why horses aren't sea captains. The end of my lecture. And so circling back to the actual original topic of discussion for the video, which if you remember was, are there bad people out there, or are there good and bad people? Well, the extremely, at least relatively to other animals, skewed nature of the nature versus nurture dichotomy in the humans towards the side of nature, towards the side of nurture, nurturing from nature, as in we're dependent on our environment for the way that our prefrontal cortex and the rest of our brains develop, throws kind of a monkey wrench into the dualist, you know, yes, there are bad people type of thinking. And so to take an extreme example of a hypothetical experiment, which we would never run nowadays because there has been moral progress because of things like the Enlightenment, but we could still do a thought experiment of, which would be of like, let's say you took like a human infant from the day it was born, and you fed it and you gave it supplies and things and cleaned up after it, but you put it in a room and it heard nothing for 20 years from the day it was born up until it was 20 years old of a tape. You taught it English and stuff, you taught it how to play with blocks, but then once it learned, you played nothing but a tape recording of somebody saying destroy all, and then you put an ethnicity. You could say Jews, you could say Slavs, you could say anything that you want. And then you took that person and you brought it into the real world. How would that person interact with the real world? I think it's not too much of a leap to say that that person would be among the most racist, destructive, genocidal people that one could ever imagine. And I think that we can agree that that person, even though they might be the worst person in terms of things that they have done or do or want to do, or the concepts and values that they have, that we could imagine, it's hard to say that that person's a bad person, because any one of us would probably be that person in that same environment. But people might say that's kind of a radical example. Well, let's say instead of that, where you have that one individual propagandized constantly in a way that isn't really realistic, you have somebody that was born in the mid-1920s in the Weimar Republic and in Germany, and then was raised through the 40s. And a certain perspective and racism and genocidal media might have spread throughout the culture as well. And unless they were a very special person, born into special circumstances within that environment, they could range from anywhere from indifferent and passive, and therefore extremely problematic in their response to Nazism, to like a Nazi themselves. And so, but then if we said with the last person that it's not entirely their fault, how could you blame somebody else who's in relatively the same circumstance, but just in a society where it's just widespread and common? And then you could play that game to, you know, less and less extreme degrees with like somebody that was born in Britain during the 1700s, and they might be justifying the expansion there, or they're born in Spain and they were, you know, sympathetic of conquistadors, or, you know, colonists in America expanding outwards as they kill off the Native Americans and justify slavery. There's reasons that they're justifying them. They're socioeconomic and they're political and they're complex, but the fact remains that these people were born in these cultures and they were a product of their environment. So I run through all of that just to make the simple point that there are fundamentally no bad people, or at least I would argue that there's really no bad people except for in a narrow circumstance, which I'll get to in a moment. But by and large, insofar as somebody's a bad person, it's because they do bad things. But it's just as likely that if they were raised in a different environment that they would be a good person, or that a good person who might be thumbing their nose at a bad person because of the bad things that they do, and they might be right in condemning those bad things, and they probably are right, could just as easily, if they were born in a different time or a different location or to a different family with a different culture and a different perspective and set of beliefs, have adopted those same beliefs and then would be condemning themselves, because it's not something that's bone deep or genetic that's made these people bad people. There are people that are sociopaths and psychopaths, and one could argue that they're fundamentally bad people, but I would even go to say, first of all, they're the exception. There's not very many of them. And then also, are they really bad people if they were literally born that way? That's what we're saying about them. They were born without any type of empathy or any concern for others. Well, if that's literally how they born, are they bad people? Is a tiger a bad person? It's obviously not a person. Is a tiger fundamentally evil because it just has no conception of empathy for the gazelles that it attacks? No, it's not a bad person. It's a tiger. But it was just born in that way, and that's the same with psychopaths. But that's not what it is for most people. Most people are shaped by their environments, and me or you or anybody else could just as easily have been shaped by those factors if we were in their circumstance. Now, that's not to say that you can't condemn people for doing bad things, and I would argue that most of what I do on this channel is condemning people for doing bad things. But it's not just a random subset of people. I didn't just condemn this homeless person for throwing this can at that car, or this person for doing that bad thing, this one person for shoplifting over here. Those are bad things. This one person assaulted this person over here, but fundamentally they're not the systemic problems which are leading to the preponderance of bad things which replicate throughout society and throughout cultures, and that those people, if it was a few hundred years ago, wouldn't have been the reasons. Like prostitution isn't a bad thing, but let's say some type of low-level moral transgression that people might do, which we might agree on as bad, are not the reasons for the conquistadors, fundamentally. It's not the reasons for slavery. Those reasons had their foundations in economics, and sorry I'm talking so fast, these bugs are I just want to get through this video. But they had their foundations in the economic systems and the power structures that perpetuated those things because it was beneficial for the colonists and for the new Americans, or for the new American empire, to view slaves in a certain way and to view Native Americans in a certain way, in the same way that it's beneficial today for corporations to view that type of psychopathic lack of concern for others, let's say workers in other countries or workers in this country, or the environment and the way that that affects people or people's health, in that if they're too concerned about those things, then their corporations aren't going to be the ones profiting, because other corporations that take a more profit maximizing, less empathetic view of the repercussions of that mode of production are going to outcompete them. And so the problem in that sense is the system, and that creates bad people, and those bad people have lots of power, and so they should be criticized, not the people with a little amount of power. But fundamentally the system itself should be the thing that's criticized, not the people. This video is already probably too long, and so I'm not going to get lost in a labyrinth of discussion around free will, because that would take forever. But even irrespective of that, I mentioned earlier, there's like one set of circumstances which I think could properly be called, you know, you could call people bad people or doing bad things fundamentally if they engage in this way, and that's a way that I engage in and other people always engage in as well, which is when you know something's wrong because you've, for whatever reason, because of your circumstances, you developed an ethical framework that says this thing is wrong and ideally it would be correct, but then you do that thing anyways. And so, like, let's say I, you know, recognize that factory farms are the worst thing in the world, but once in a while I still get a burger when I'm out traveling because I'm super hungry. Or, you know, people might say, they might come to the conclusion, valid or not, that, you know, sweatshops are over the top and I'm not going to purchase any products from this company, but then they go to the store, they see a pair of shoes they really like, they're like, okay, I'll get just this one. Well, that's a circumstance where you know what you're doing is wrong, but doing it anyways. And so that, I would argue, is the only circumstance where you could call somebody a bad person. But again, I don't think that the main problem is individual people acting in a way that they know themselves is bad and immoral, but doing it anyways. I think that's a problem. I think it should be discussed, but I don't think it's the main problem. The main problem, as I mentioned, is the warping of morality itself culturally, in the same way that we can identify in the past with the examples that I mentioned, by today's current institutions, politically and economically. So specifically, the ideology of profit maximizing taking forefront ahead of you know, the well-being of people, animals, the planet, so on and so forth, has caused a litany of problems to cascade downward that might infect people's morality. Or religion obviously has a lot of problems with it. Maybe there's some good things in it, but there's a lot of problems in it too. And so you could even take an example, this is going to be kind of a hot take, but if you follow me in good faith here, I think that people would come to the same conclusion. Even take a abortion clinic bomber, which is a terrible thing, obviously. But the reason that they're doing it is that they literally think this, that they are murdering thousands of babies in there. They're literally baby murderers. They're murdering them. It's equivalent to the Holocaust. If you look at right-wing propaganda, there's tons of comparisons, like, oh, look, another Holocaust, and, you know, over 2 years nobody does anything about it. Well, these people think that they're literally helping to stop a Holocaust of babies by bombing this abortion clinic, and that way they're acting like the resistant to the Nazis, much more so than the people who say that it's bad, of which there are a lot of them, like conservatives, that don't bomb abortion clinics, thankfully. But one could argue that if they really believe that and they have the convictions which they claim to espouse, the more moral thing to do would be what this person who bombed the abortion clinic was. And so which is obviously good that they're not doing that, but the problem is that people have that conception in the first place because religion and a lack of critical thinking skills have led them to the belief that this blasphemer, or this two-cell, you know, individualized fertilized egg, these zygotes, are equivalent to this, a person. Okay, and there's obviously a wide, there's a big spectrum, and that's a big conversation if you want to talk about that as well. But that belief that this is equivalent to the Holocaust is what has caused this person to act in that way. And so the problem is, again, the idea. So saying you're a bad person, you're an evil person, is not really going to help anything. What needs to be addressed is the ideas, and then more fundamentally, what needs to be addressed are the institutional forces which are molding those ideas into the mindsets of most of the people, or a large swath of people in society, is that they're widespread.